Here we go. At our church, Jesus is Lord. That single belief calls us together as a community and sends us into our world with hope and purpose. At our church, your past will never define your future. There's always redemption, which means there's always a brighter day. At our church, we don't think we're better than any other church out there. We're just doing our best to become our best. At our church, we want you to believe in God, but we also want you to know that God believes in you. We are not against people who don't attend church anywhere. Instead, we pursue them with love, the very same love that's pursuing us. At our church, we're learning to serve God with all our hearts, and we're learning to worship Him with all our lives. And if you're looking for the perfect church, we're not it. At our church, we will make mistakes, but we will choose to grow from them. At our church, we're part of a global community that's knit together by the resurrection of Jesus. And by the way, at our church, we believe that really happened too. At our church, we will engage with people who are in real need because we are the hands and the feet of Christ. And finally, we need you to hear this loud and clear. At our church, it's not really our church at all. It's His. And we live and move and breathe in His church for His glory and His fame, not ours. So here's the invitation. You're invited to jump in with your whole heart at your own pace and to experience the life that awaits you in Christ. Friends, this is going to be good. Welcome to our church.
This sermon is entitled The God of Every Story and is inspired by a song that we're going to listen to at the end entitled God of Every Story, written by a woman that you might have been familiar with, Laura Story, who wrote the song Blessings that you might have been familiar with. But I've been listening to this song an awful lot lately and thinking about all of our stories. Each one of us have these stories, and you know what? I don't know why we're kind of drawn to Hallmark stories, because I think most of our stories are a mix between Lifetime and science fiction, and not Hallmark. When I think down each pew and each aisle and each row, the many battles that we're all facing, the battles we have come through, the battles we will go through, the storms that we've come through and the storms we will go through, and maybe the storms that we're in at this time, I'm reminded of Joseph. And I'm reminded of the fact that while we have great promises, we go through difficult times in our stories. Our lives are made up of good times and bad times and times in between. But it's important for us to recognize that God is the God of every story, of every part of that story. It isn't that God causes problems and pain. God is certainly not the cause of problems and pain. He's certainly not the cause of chaos and confusion, but God is the author of peace. He's the author of healing. He's the giver of grace and the giver of strength to those who are willing to receive it. But God does allow stories like Joseph. He allows stories like my story and your story. And He allows all the times up and allows all the times down for a reason, for a purpose. Sometimes we get glimpses of that reason and purpose on this side of eternity. Sometimes. But I would be lying to you if I told you that we're always going to understand. We're not going to understand. And I would also lie to you saying that we are not going to walk out of this story beat up and damaged. As the Apostle Paul says, we're pressed, but we're not crushed. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. We're struck down, but not destroyed. But I don't know about you, but when you get pressed, doesn't it hurt? When you get struck down, doesn't it get hurt? Don't you get hurt? When you're persecuted, you get hurt. Yes, you're not destroyed. Yes, it doesn't have the final say, but it still hurts along the way. And yet God is still the God of that story. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob is also the God of Tanya, God of Ronnie, God of Lynn, God of Robin, God of all of us here. He's been faithful yesterday, He's faithful today, and He will be faithful tomorrow. So what do we learn from Joseph's story, and how does this apply to our story? Well, first, Joseph he has this wonderful dream that God has given to him. God gives each and every one of us this gift, the ability to dream, and He gives us wonderful dreams. Now, when Joseph shares these dreams with people around him, they don't react very kindly. His brothers get jealous of him. Even his father goes, "Do you think that I'm actually your dad going to bow down to you? You think that that the child and the parent roles are going to be reversed there?" But still, Joseph tells them these dreams. Now, Joseph has a maturity issue. And Joseph doesn't recognize that these people don't want to hear his dreams. Because these dreams are actually dreams between Joseph and the Father. We all have to recognize that sometimes God places things upon our hearts that are simply between us and the Father. They're not meant to be shared with other people. I think sometimes we're too loose with our mouth. Anybody there? We're too loose with our mouth, sharing too much, and that's what we see with Joseph. He shares too much, and jealousy overtakes his brothers. Now, obviously, they do not have a good family dynamic. Any of you can relate to great family dynamics or dysfunctional family dynamics? Well, there have been no functional families that I have found from Genesis to Revelation. Even Jesus' own family turned against him at one point in time and thought he was crazy. So, even Jesus had problems. We're going to have problems with our family. There are no functional families. And so what ends up happening is the brothers begin to plot. And they're like, we got to get rid of this guy. And think about it this way. They're like, well, first we're going to throw him in the cistern and we're going to let him die, or let's murder him. No, let's throw him. Then let's sell him. And think about, his life is only worth 20 shekels that they then do that. But think about also these brothers. These brothers then torture their father and make their father go into mourning. These are some despicable people. They weren't just going after Joseph, they were going after and hurting the dad. The dad goes into mourning for weeks and cannot be comforted because of what these brothers did. And then they go, well, you know what, we're not going to kill him. We'll sell him, because after all, that's the humane thing to do. We are brothers. We're family. We'll just sell them there. So I'm very comforted in the fact that there's dysfunctional people from Genesis to Revelation, and I'm very comforted by the fact that we have a faith that says, and when we see Jesus, we shall be like him. We shall be changed in a moment. And the story doesn't end with the dysfunction, but Joseph's story goes on. So we saw this, that he ends up in there, and he ends up the father's told that there's a murder that has happened there, that a wild animal has killed his son. But that's just the beginning of Joseph's problems. Now, Joseph had this wonderful dream, but look at this little timeline there. So he's the favorite son, age 15 to 17. Then he's sold into slavery. As he's sold into slavery, he then becomes head of Potiphar's household, the household manager there. He shows himself to be a very good manager. But then Potiphar's wife starts eyeing Joseph, because apparently he was as good looking as I am. And she was looking at him, and she began to lust after him, and she wanted him. And so, but Joseph was an honorable person and wouldn't sleep with her. So she made up a lie, and Joseph ends up in jail. So now, by the way, let's backtrack here. Joseph had a dream. He was the favorite son. He had this nice coat, the coat of many colors, all that stuff. Then he ends up in a cistern. He ends up sold into slavery. Then he works his way up to be the head slave, and now he's a criminal. Now he's in jail. So notice the trend line there. This doesn't sound like a great dream, and it doesn't sound like a great story. And we have to recognize that Joseph is a human being. And Joseph, as a human being going through this story, wouldn't be feeling mighty good about all this. Now, it doesn't mean that Joseph wavered in his faith, but I'm sure that there were moments that he wavered. I'm sure that there were moments that he doubted. I'm sure there were lots of moments that he cried. We know that there were moments that he was angry as he's going through all this, and it's important to understand he had the full range of human emotions that you and I go through. Heroes are just the things that we read about, but they are people that went through things. The heroes of the faith went through things. So then not only is he in prison, but then he becomes like the head of the prison. He's the prison manager. Wherever Joseph goes, he ends up getting in charge of stuff. But yet he is still in jail. Notice that Joseph remains faithful even if he's in jail. He remains faithful even when he's a slave. He remains faithful and true to those things. But Joseph, remember, he had maturity. And the way we learn maturity a lot of times is going through the valleys. It's going around the mountain over and over again. But God had a reason. There was something God was going to allow that was going to be good out of this. And so then Joseph ends up becoming second in command of all of Egypt, because he interprets a dream. He becomes trusted by Pharaoh, and he ends up saving the lives of many people, including his brothers and his father. So what do we learn from this story? We learn that bad things happen. Bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, but bad things happen. Joseph, as he gets older, this is what he says to his brothers in Genesis 15, 19 through 21. When they come and bow down to him, when they recognize their need from him, he says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. In this regard, many times people look at Joseph as another Jesus figure, a Jesus figure in the Genesis genre there. Because, right, you intended to harm me through the cross, but God intended it for good for many people. There's something sacramental about the pain that we go through in our lives. There's something sacramental, and what a sacrament is a way that we experience God's grace and we share God's grace in a different way. It's not through our brute strength that people come to know God's grace. Indeed, it wasn't through God's brute strength that we know God's grace. It was through God's willingness to suffer with us, to suffer among us, and to even suffer at our hands, to be made a servant, a suffering servant, as it tells us in the book of Isaiah. And so we see this same pattern with Joseph, that his suffering prepared him to be able to help other people. The Bible puts it this way in 1 Peter, "We comfort others with the comfort we ourselves have received from Christ." If we're never in a position where we have to receive that comfort, then we're never in the position to give out that comfort. But here's the other thing about receiving comfort from God. Jesus tells us this principle: to whom much is given, much is required. We who have received comfort are required to give out that comfort. Notice what it says, and he reassured them and he spoke kindly to them. He took care of them, because Joseph did recognize that though he was in that cistern, he wasn't dead. Though he was in that slavery household, he wasn't abandoned. And though he was in prison, he kept waiting for that time of redemption. And that time of redemption did come. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning. We don't know how long that morning is going, or how long that night's going to be. But the promise is that morning comes. But here's a responsibility that comes when we get to that point of morning. It's our job to go back into the night. Not to go back into the night to sit there and have a pity party for ourselves, but to go back into the night to sit with other people. See, I like to tell this story when I talk about all the homeless ministries that we've started in Cumberland County, and I talk about the guy named, focus here, thank you. Talk about the guy named Joe, and Joe falls into the pit, and Joe can't get out of the pit. So a preacher comes walking by, a priest comes walking by, and he gets, hey, Father, I'm in the pit. Can you help me out? And the priest goes, I'm on my way to church. I don't have time. So he writes out a prayer and he throws it into the pit. A couple minutes later goes by, and now Joe has a prayer, but he can't get out of the pit. A couple minutes later will go by, and a doctor comes walking by. And he goes, hey, Doc, I'm in the pit. Can you help me out? Doc goes, I'm late for surgery. Here's a prescription. And he throws it into the pit. So now Joe's sitting there with a prescription and a prayer, but he's in a pit. Some time goes by, and Joe's like, this is hopeless. And finally he hears his buddy Bill walking by, and he goes, hey, Bill, I'm in the pit. Can you help me out? And Bill goes, what are you doing down there? He goes, well, I fell. And he goes, all right, I'll help you out. And he jumps in the pit. Now Joe looks at Bill and goes, you idiot. Now we're both in the pit. Why did you do that? And what Bill says is this: I've been down in this pit before, I know the way out. That's why I jumped back in. For those of us who make it through these difficult times in life, it is not our job to lord it over other people. It's not our job to boast, but it's our job to sit with other people, to provide for other people, to help other people, to comfort other people, because we recognize to whom much is given, much is required. Jesus jumped in the pit with us. It's our job now to jump in the pit for other people and show them the way out. That's what we see within Joseph's story. You intended this to harm me. Bad things are going to come. Bad things, and there are all types of reasons why bad things are going to happen. People have all kinds of motives. There's all kinds of evil that goes on in this world, but my friends, you don't need to blame the devil for a bad day. You do a pretty good job of doing it yourself. Amen? And you do a pretty good job at making somebody else have a bad day too. Don't need the devil walking around doing it. We got lots of them walking around doing it. But what was intended for your destruction does not have to remain a place of destruction, but can be a place of blessing. Let me say that again. A place of destruction can actually be a place of blessing. Because the Bible talks about this idea of when we are humbled before the Lord, that is when we humble ourselves. Now, either you can humble yourself or God will humble you. Those are the two choices. I'm learning that I prefer to humble myself, because if God does it, it hurts. Anybody feel that with me? It's like, really, you're humbling me again? But when you humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, it isn't for the purpose of humbling yourself so that God pushes you down. God pushes us down so that He can truly lift us up. When we are lifted up in His mighty power. That's why it says, though I'm weak, He is strong. And I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that His strength will fall fresh upon me. So, how do we find the good found in bad? Romans 8:28, and I'm looking at 8:28, but I want to go on to 8:30 because sometimes we just take one verse out of context and we lose sight of the whole point. This is what it says in the Amplified Version. We are assured and know that God, being a partner in their labor, all things working together and are fitting into a plan for good to and for those who love God and are called according to His design and purpose. And everybody goes, oh, amen. All things are working together for good. But that doesn't feel really good when you're going through bad, does it? You might hold on to that promise, but I need you to understand what that promise says. First, let's go back to the Lord's Prayer. You don't say, my Father. You say, our Father. You say, don't give me my bread. Give us our daily bread. The idea is this. We're family. We're in it together. It's not just about me. It's about our good. The family good. And what God says is good. I like when Jesus deals with this guy. This one guy comes up to him and he goes, good teacher, and he stops him. He says, don't call me good. Now this is Jesus saying, don't call me good. Only the Father in heaven is good. In other words, this is what Jesus is saying. You don't know what's good. You don't know what is truly good. Our good is based upon our temporary given situation at a moment in time. But if we go back into a moment of time, we might say that wasn't good, but God turned it into something good. That's one wonderful thing about God, is He is the great recycler in chief. He takes what other people throw away, what other people regard as junk, and He turns it around and makes it into something good. So, but notice it says, all things work together and are fitting into a plan for not my good, not your good, but for good to those who love God. That's those who love God before, those who love God today, and those who will love God tomorrow. We're always building upon the foundation of God's grace with the legacy of faith in our lives. We're just building a foundation. When we recognize this, we're reading Tuesdays with Maury in Sunday school, and there's this scene where he talks about an ocean and an ocean wave. And these waves are riding along in the ocean, and this young wave is all excited about how great this is. And it's like, ooh, this is fun, riding up and down the wave. And then the little wave is talking to the old wave, telling the old wave how much fun it is. And then the little wave looks up to the shoreline and sees that all the waves are hitting the shoreline and they're dispersing. And he goes, this is terrible. Look at all the waves. They're dying. And the old wave says to the young wave, you know what your problem is? You think you're a wave. You're just part of the ocean. We're always looking at ourselves as the wave, but we're just part of the ocean of God's grace, of God's faithfulness. The story begins with Him, the story ends with Him, and the story ends with all of us together with Him. But it was all about Him, for Him, in Him, through Him. We find our completion, we find our faith, we find our hope. This is what it goes on to say in Romans 8:29-30. This is God's definition of good. He goes on to define it. Paul says, for those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He also justified. Those He justified, He also glorified. What does all that theological mumbo-jumbo mean? Let me explain it to you, breaking down this way. God's good is for us to be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters and to be like Jesus. Jesus was the firstborn. He's the new Adam. He's the new model. And God's desire is for all of us to be like Him. Now we all go, oh yes, I want to be like Jesus. Lord, let me be like Jesus, but keep the poor people away from me. Lord, let me be like Jesus, but keep the enemies away from me. Lord, let me be like Jesus and don't make me responsible for the dysfunctional people in my life. I don't really need to say much more than that, do I? You get the point? Jesus came and lived in the midst of His enemies, and He loved them to the very end. He came with all the dysfunctional people, and He gave them bread. He gave them fish. He gave them the bread of life. He gave them the water that would quench their soul, but He also gave them cool water to drink. This is what it means to be like Jesus, to literally take up our cross and to recognize that when we take up our cross, it is a cross of suffering, it is a cross of shame, and it's hard. I'm also comforted with this. When Jesus took His cross, He didn't bear it alone, but there was someone that came in that was called in to help carry that cross. Goes back to that point that we're all in it together. It's our job to help one another carry the load, to share in the burden. Jesus himself didn't have to do it all by himself. There was somebody there to help him carry that load. But Jesus was crucified. This is what it says. We use that Sunday or that Friday and we call it Good Friday. It's only good because you recognize what happened on Sunday. That's why we're able to look back and say it's Good Friday. When Jesus is crucified, it's good only because of the resurrection that took place on Sunday. My friends, many of us are going through Friday. Or we might be living in Saturday, where nothing seems to be happening. Nothing seems to be changing. But that's where my friend Tony Campolo says, it may be Friday, but Sunday's coming. It may be Saturday, but Sunday's coming. Joni Eareckson Tada, who became paralyzed through a tragic accident, said this: God permits what he hates to accomplish what he loves. God permits what he hates to accomplish what he loves. It's important for us to recognize that the bad that we go through, what parent wants their kid to go through bad stuff? No parent wants their kid to go through bad stuff. But every parent wants their kid to be mature. Every parent wants their kid to be complete. Every parent wants their kid to be healthy. And you know what? In order to get to a healthy adulthood, you're going to go through some pain. You're going to have to allow your kid to go through some stuff. As much as you want to keep that kid from going through stuff, how many of you have heard the analogy and you know the story? If you help a bird try to get out of the egg, when it's trying to get out and you try to help it, it'll never be able to fly because it's only through the strength of pushing out of the egg that the bird is able to gain the strength to fly. God uses what he hates to accomplish what he loves. He has a greater purpose than what our little bitty brains can think of. Isaiah 53:10 in the Message translation said, still it's what God had in mind all along, talking about Jesus and the cross. This was prophesied, to crush him with pain. The plan was that he give himself as an offering for sin so that he'd see life come from it. Now, by the way, to crush him with pain, the paragraph didn't end there. Notice, to crush him with pain, so that the plan was that he would give himself as an offering for sin so that he'd see life come from it. Life, life, and more life. And God's plan was deeply prospered through him. God's plan is for life. But we have to push to get to life. You mamas know that you needed to push to get to life. There's a reason why men don't give birth. There would be no more children. You know, men have no threshold for pain, and we would just look at one person and go, I ain't doing that. But you got to push to get through life. God's idea was that Jesus was crushed. His own son was crushed. See, people go, how can God allow this to happen to my kid? Where is God when this happens? God's the same place that he was when his kid was crushed for us. God's at the same place there, and God does the same thing. I don't know how he does it. I don't know when he will do it. I just know. That's where faith comes into play. I just know that joy comes in the morning. I just know that life is going to come from death. I just know that God can take this pain, and it may not bring me life, but it might bring somebody else life. The pain was not good for Jesus. Jesus did nothing to deserve that pain. But because Jesus went through that pain, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And Jesus says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Not some people, not the religious people, not the haters. all people to myself. Love wins. That's what Jesus is saying here. Life wins through the cross. And this is what I also need us to understand. We may get to resurrection. Joseph got to a resurrection point. His life was there to help a bunch of other people there. He had scars. I bet if we had modern day psychology back there, he'd have PTSD. He would have had abandonment issues, trust issues, all kinds of issues. We all got issues. I know some of your issues, and you got them. But here's the thing, Jesus, when he's resurrected with the scars. The scars that Jesus continues to bear in his hands, his feet, and his side today are there to remind us that our scars, they remain with us, but they do not define us. We get to experience resurrection despite the scars, but we should acknowledge the fact that the scars are there. And the scars can be something that is beautiful. A mama who gives birth, you know, you women go through a whole lot of stuff when you give birth. When you're carrying a child, it messes up your body, all kinds of stuff. But that's beautiful. It's beautiful because it shows a labor of love. It shows what you went through, what you've gone through, and what you would do again. Because some of you are crazy enough that you do it again after one. But you would do it again. You got the cuts and the scars and the bruises, you have the tears, you have the stuff, but you wouldn't trade it all. You would do it again. Because the goal is life, life, and more life. And women, let me ask you something. Who were you created out of? You were created in the image of God. In the image of God, he created you. So in that gift of life that you give out, you show what God does for each and every one of us. You show that. You are created in that image. Think about that every time we go through pain. And by the way, when parents say to me, oh, I must be an awful parent, look at what my kids do. Look at what God's children have done. And yet we call him the good father. We are never abandoned nor forsaken. We learn that in these times of great difficulty and trial. It's only during times of heartbreak that we're able to listen. But I think C.S. Lewis said this, God whispers in our pleasure, but he shouts in our pain. It's God's megaphone by which he is rousing a deaf and dying world. Psalm 34:18-19, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Notice it doesn't say he prevents them from being crushed in spirit. He saves them when we are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, and indeed Jesus says in this world you will have trouble. You'll have lots of it, many troubles. But the Lord delivers him and her from them all. The Lord delivers us from those troubles, but deliverance doesn't mean avoidance. Deliverance means he gets us through. Isaiah 41:10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed. For I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. How many of us have experienced that in the darkness of our lives? God, somehow we are able to stand. Somehow we are just able to stand, and somehow we get peace. And where does that peace come? That's where Paul says peace that surpasses all understanding. In other words, you shouldn't have any peace, but you got it. Why? Because God says you are never abandoned, you are never forsaken. You may feel like it, but when you feel like it, that's when you got to say, I'm not listening to my feelings because my feelings lie. I'm listening to my faith, where I say, I may not know, but I do. I may not know up here, but I know down here. Through the trials and difficulties, we learn about God's great faithfulness, and we learn about the amazing grace afforded to us. 2 Timothy 2:13, even though we are faithless, how many of us are faithless and wander off in our minds? How many of you wandered off? You constantly wander off. You don't even need to wander from a pew. Because as we learned a couple weeks ago, there's a lot of lost people sitting in pews. But even though we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny who he is. This is part of God's identity. It is his DNA. Just like God is love, you can't make him love you anymore. You can't make him love you any less. You also can't make him unfaithful. You can keep on cheating on him. God's going to keep on coming after you. Because he loves you. He's obsessed with you. I think he wakes up in the morning and goes, I wonder what Fran's thinking right now. Wonder what Deb's thinking. Wonder if she's thinking about me. Wouldn't it be, don't you, when you have a crush on somebody, don't you just want that good night text? That good, you know what I'm talking about. Well, some of you are so old that remember the good night note? Or the person serenading you with a rock outside. Now you have ADT and the alarm would go off. But you want to know that they're thinking about you. God's thinking about you. Question is, are we thinking about him? But no matter how much we reject him, he still keeps coming back for more. 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about this idea that he had these great revelations of God. He had these great revelations, and yet God allowed a thorn in the flesh to come into him. Now, we don't know what that thorn was. We don't know whether it was a disease. We don't know if it was heartache. We don't know what it was. Because if we knew what it was, here's what would happen. We would go, I have the same thorn as Paul does. I must be so holy. But no, we don't know what the thorn is, but Paul says, God, take it from me. And he says it 3 times. How many of us have said, God, take this pain away? Take it away 3 times. And this is what God writes back, says back to him. This is God's love note. My grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weakness. Once, and this Paul says this, once I heard that, I was glad to let it happen. I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. Now I take my limitations in stride and with good cheer. Those limitations that cut me down to size, abuse, accidents, opposition, bad breaks, I just let Christ take over. And so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. Amen? Amen. Amen. Thank you, Jimmy. So this is what I want you to take with you. And then it's on the PowerPoint, it's on the website there. You can always look at it. What do we do in the midst of the difficult times? I'm sure Joseph had a pity party. Have your pity party, but don't stay there. And don't invite a lot of other people to come, because we only want things that are fun and good appetizers. All right? So have your pity party. There's a time to cry. Remember, Joseph's dad, there's a time to mourn, there's a time to cry, and then there's a time to call it off, and it's a time to move on. Second thing is, be still and remember who God is. And by the way, I want to tell you, when I say move on, I don't mean to say that somehow that mourning ever ends. I'm just saying we take it, and now rather than sitting and looking at it, we use it. Second thing, be still, remember who God is. Third, wait patiently for the Lord. Waiting for the Lord does not imply that I'm passive. This is what it means. I'm constantly praying. I'm constantly praising him wherever I'm at. And I got to go wash some people's feet. When we're hurting, that's our time to go wash feet. There's something therapeutic about washing feet. Jesus, before he is getting ready to be abandoned and rejected and crucified, before he cries out, Father, why have you forsaken me? Just the night before, he was washing feet. My friends, if that's what Jesus did to get to Sunday, that's what we got to do to get to Sunday. You got to remember who you are, that you are more than a conqueror in all this. But more than a conqueror, conquerors go through battles. You don't get the title of general unless you've been tested. You don't get the title of conqueror unless you have something to conquer. 5, remember where you belong. This world ain't your home. This world's always going to let us down. Remember that we are in this world, but we are not of this world. And then remember what God is doing. God's doing something good. He wants all of us to get to know Him. He wants all of us to experience His love. He wants all of us to just be a family, to be at His table. Remember what He's doing through it all.
Here's a few reasons why people don't go to church.
I can't come to church until I get my life together.
Church is how I got my life together.
Church is filled with a bunch of hypocrites.
And there's always room for one more.
All they care about is your money.
They care about me, not about my money.
Is there some kind of dress code?
Yes, the code is wear some clothes.
Church, it just makes me nervous. I was nervous at first, and then I felt right at home.
I'm not sure I believe everything that you believe.
But you can still belong.
Church is for wimpy, girly men.
You want to say that again?
If you knew me and what I've done, you wouldn't want me.
If you knew me and what I've done, you wouldn't be worried.
You can come to my church even if you were brought up Catholic,
Baptist,
Methodist,
Jewish,
Mormon,
Lutheran,
Pentecostal,
Presbyterian,
Church of Christ,
Southern Baptist.
a little bit of everything and a whole lot of nothing.
See, it's not about a religion, it's about a relationship.
So please, come to my church.
Where nobody's perfect.
Where beginners are welcome.
Where socks are optional.
but grace is required.
Where forgiveness is offered.
Where hope is alive.
And where it's okay to not be okay. Really.